When I disappeared beneath the surface, they believed the story was over. But the ocean does not forget. It remembers sound. It remembers fear. It remembers names that were never written down. And long after my body went silent, their voices remained. Tell me, what happens to a scream when there is no one left to hear it? The night did not end when I sank. It only grew quieter. Lifeboats drifted in the darkness, wooden islands of the living surrounded by a world of the dead. Some prayed. Some stared into the water. Some could not speak at all. And around them, voices, calling, crying, fading. The survivors would later say the silence that followed was worse than the screams, because silence confirms that no one is coming. The ocean was not merely water. It was cold beyond mercy. Those who entered it did not drown at first. They froze. Muscles stiffened, breath shortened, strength vanished. And still they called out. Not in panic, but in hope. Hope that someone, somewhere, was still listening. But tell me, how long does hope survive when the body cannot? There were other ships nearby, lights on the horizon, signals rising into the sky. Flares burned like distant stars, briefly turning night into day. One ship saw them and turned back to sleep. By the time help arrived, the sea had already decided who would be remembered and who would disappear. History would later argue over blame, over distance, over minutes, over missed chances. But no argument can change this. Help delayed is help denied. Those who survived carried more than relief. They carried questions. Why them? Why not the others? Some never spoke of that night again. Others spoke of it every day. Many would wake in the darkness, years later, hearing water where there was none. They were saved from the sea, but not from memory. Tell me, is survival always a gift, or sometimes a burden? Days later, ships returned to the place where I fell, not to rescue, but to retrieve. They found bodies floating in silence, preserved by the cold, faces caught somewhere between fear and peace. Some were recognized, many were not. They buried the unknown at sea, marking graves with numbers instead of names. And I watched from below, unable to speak, as they decided who would be remembered and who would vanish again. Investigations followed, rooms filled with questions, tables covered in documents, voices searching for answers. They debated speed, they debated ice, They debated blame. But no report asked the hardest question. Why did confidence outweigh caution? Why were there not enough lifeboats? Why were warnings ignored? Why did certainty feel safer than truth? They called my sinking an accident. But accidents do not follow patterns. Arrogance does. After me, the world changed. More lifeboats, new rules, voices that must always be heard through the night. My destruction became instruction. It took over 1,000 lives for humanity to remember that nature does not negotiate. They learned, but only after the lesson was written in water. And ask yourself, why does change so often require catastrophe? I am no longer moving, but I am not silent. Every year they speak my name. Every year they tell my story. Yet most remember the ship, not the voices. Not the ones who called out in the dark, believing help would come. Those voices sank with me. And somewhere in the cold Atlantic, they still echo. Not asking to be saved, only asking to be acknowledged. Because history records disasters, but memory decides who is allowed to live on. And some voices are still waiting to be heard. Because history records disasters, but memory decides who is allowed to live on. And some voices are still waiting to be heard. But I was not the last. There were others, built with the same certainty, launched with the same pride, and sent into the same unforgiving sea. And they too believed they could not sink. Tell me, how many times must history drown before we finally learn to listen?
History in the Shadows. New episodes every week.